I'm going to take you through which sections of Chapter 13 in the Lange pathophysiology text you need for the first case of the food to fuel block. The first thing to notice here is that I'm starting on page 33 of the download, so you can skip the first 32 pages unless you want to review physiology. So starting with disorders of motility, I want you to read that section. Note that they mention some diseases that you may be hearing about with your other disciplines: Hirschsprung disease, gastroparesis, Zollinger-Ellison, pyloric stenosis, and then we'll get to irritable bowel syndrome later in the block. This case will focus on some of the types of disorders of secretion, so peptic ulcers, including duodenal ulcer and gastric ulcer. You can skip the big section that's GI manifestations of systemic disease, including this really big table, unless it's interesting to you. And then picking it up on page 37, pathophysiology of disorders of the esophagus, including esophageal achalasia, the clinical presentation, and the etiology. You can skip the pathology and pathogenesis section, but do read the clinical manifestations. Then for reflux esophagitis, read clinical presentation, etiology, including table 13.5, which is here. Note the things that decrease pressure in the lower esophageal sphincter. And then in terms of pathology and pathogenesis, this is pretty much the summary here, this figure, so you could just focus on this figure here. Clinical manifestations are discussed right here, and then that is the end of esophagus. Getting into pathophysiology of disorders of the stomach, acid-peptic disease, including the clinical presentation, the etiology, focusing on figure 13, chapter 13, figure 18, and figure 19. So this is a nice Venn diagram that could be helpful for you. You do not need to know all the detailed pathology and pathogenesis. This figure right here summarizes a lot of it, including the sections here: gastric ulcer, acute erosive gastritis, chronic atrophic gastritis, and duodenal ulcer. These are all summarized in figure 19. Clinical manifestations. I will draw your attention to the checkpoint. I skipped over it for esophagus, but these are nice questions to just make sure that you're getting the main points of the chapter. Do look at gastroparesis. It's a common complication of uncontrolled diabetes. You do not need to, this is something else, but you don't need to worry about that table. The etiology of gastroparesis. You don't need to know the detailed pathology and pathogenesis from our perspective, but do read the clinical manifestations. So that's it. Let us know if you have issues.